I am Curran Bhatia, joined by Keith Idec. You know him as a senior writer, columnist at boxingscene.com. Keith, how are you doing, my man?
Good, my man. How you doing?
Good. So wanted to chat with you. There's so much going on in the world of boxing. Let's start with, of course, the pound for pound number one, Canelo Alvarez, the Canelo sweepstakes. We had that play out. Seems like a lot of people in the boxing world generally wait to see what Canelo does before making their own move. Of course, it was reported by you and many others. PBC offered Charlo and Benavidez the reported number 100 million. Also, Matchroom DAZN offered Bivol, Triple G Trilogy, reported 85 million, 100 million. Not really sure. Who knows exactly when you take in buys and other things like that. Why do you think Canelo went the route of the Matchroom DAZN deal over the PBC deal?
I think he wants to ultimately become the fully unified light heavyweight champion. And this is his path to making that happen. You know, he fights Dimitri Bivol. He feels it's a fight that he'll win, obviously. And then he would have the opportunity, at least once he's done, in his opinion, beating Bivol, beating Triple G, and then whoever he's going to fight in December, which might be a lesser fight than those two. And then for his first fight of 2023, fight the winner of Joe Smith Jr. and Artur Beterbiev for all of the light heavyweight titles, which would give him an opportunity to become a fully unified champion in a second division.
That would be a tremendous accomplishment. And if anyone can do it, it's Canelo. We've seen what he's done, gobbling up these belts. Now, there's one thing to say, you know, I want to fight 3 times this year. A lot of things can happen, as we've seen, of course, through the last few years. Injuries can happen. Things like pandemics can happen. There's a million things that could happen, but it's definitely a great plan. And we've seen Canelo execute on these plans before. In terms of the zone, they're pivoting now to have a pay-per-view model. In terms of pricing, we know the monthly is there. And then now there's a pay-per-view for bigger fights. Joe Markowski made he was open about it. He said, hey, in the beginning, we said we were not going to do it. Now we are. So they're not shying away from it. What are your thoughts on the zone trying the pay-per-view model? If you look at any business or startup or whatever you want to call it, it's pretty normal to make pivots and look at numbers and make adjustments. And it seems like that's what they're doing here. What are your thoughts?
Well, what's not normal is when you enter a business that you have not been in to say that you're going to put everyone else in effect out of business, which is kind of what they were trying to say. They were a little too arrogant and bold about it, to be honest with you. They've learned that lesson the hard way. And they now know that the boxing business is such because it needs to be that way. Fighters' expectations are that they're going to make a certain amount of money. The business model is what it is. You're not changing that. So don't try to come in and reinvent the wheel. And again, they learned that the hard way. You can't pay Canelo Alvarez somewhere between $40 and $50 million and take $9.99 per month from people and figure out a way to pay that without losing money. Again, they learned the lesson the hard way. I give Joe a lot of credit for copping to it, so to speak, and saying, hey, look, you know, we made some miscalculations. We made some mistakes. We were very ambitious in the beginning, probably said some things that we should not have said. So let's move forward. Some people don't want to forgive them for that. I don't really see the point in that entirely because it is what it is. I mean, what do you want them to go before a firing squad or what exactly? All right. So they promised you that they wouldn't charge you $80 for a fight. And now they are. If it bothers you that much, don't buy it. It's not a birthright to watch boxing for whatever it costs. And sometimes it gets very frustrating with people on Twitter, and Twitter ain't the real world, as you and I well know, because it's a very small percentage of people that actually watch boxing. There are some very smart, passionate people on there. And there are some people that are just outrageously unrealistic about what they expect, and they're going to complain no matter what. Bottom line is Canelo Alvarez has set the bar for what he's going to make. This is what it's going to cost to watch him fight. Put on your big boy pants and pay for it, or don't. But you're not being wronged in some egregious way here. It is what it is.
For so long, people have talked about the popularity of boxing and how it can become a mainstream sport in terms of like the 4 big players in America. And of course, pay-per-view it's where it's been recently. People look back at the older ages when it was on national TV. You made money through advertisements on those big channels. And obviously people have tried that. People have tried streaming. At this point in time, just you as an observer and seeing everything that's going on, do you think there's other ways to be successful, or at the end of the day, does it just come back to pay-per-view?
I think at the highest level, it's going to be a pay-per-view model because successful people don't like losing money. Len Blavatnik is no exception. He lost a lot of money bankrolling DAZN for the first 3.5 years, and he's just not going to do it anymore. He has put some restrictions on what they can spend on fights. They're not wasting money like they did in the beginning, trying to lure American fighters or fighters from wherever who frankly aren't worth the money. They grossly overpaid for Devin Haney. They learned the hard way. Wasn't worth it exactly. Devin Haney's an excellent fighter, does not have the enormous fan base that his Instagram following or whatever would lead you to believe. No one else is willing to pay him, and this is now playing out. I understand the ambition in the beginning because they had to overspend. They're trying to make their mark in this market in which they did not exist. So you have to be aggressive. You have to overspend a little bit, but you can't do that in the long term because no one's going to pay for it. If it's Showtime, PBC, you all have people to answer to, and you can't just keep, wasting money, so to speak, on bad investments. And so I guess the short answer to your question, though, is that for the top fights, Canelo Alvarez certainly counts as such. The pay-per-view model is there to stay. Now, does it need to be $80 necessarily? I don't know that, and it shouldn't be higher than that, even for the biggest fights. Mayweather Pacquiao was 100, of course, but if it were the thing is, you and I both know that if it was 2 or 3 times per year, rational people wouldn't have a problem with it. Passionate boxing fans wouldn't have a problem with it. It's when you come in with the Charles Martin and Luis Ortiz, even for $40, or Keith Thurman and Mario Barrios for $8.75, but whatever it was. That's where the people have problems, and rightfully so.
And that actually leads me to my next question. We were talking about the major networks and, having boxing on their platform. Of course, Fox, the last few years has been involved in boxing in both broadcast and pay-per-view. This year, though, in 2022, they've only done two events, and those were both pay-per-views, Luis Ortiz versus Charles Martin, as you mentioned, and the Keith Thurman pay-per-view. We haven't seen a lot on the Fox Sports schedule. So what do you expect to see for the future of boxing and Fox Sports?
Unfortunately, Fox has devolved into a pay-per-view distributor. That's what they are right now. And you have to call it like it is, basically, right? I am a Paramount employee, just for full disclosure, for people who don't know that. Our BoxingScene.com is owned by Paramount, which used to be Viacom CBS, which also owns Showtime, which has a deal with PBC. So just let's operate off that. But Fox's involvement in boxing was very encouraging in the beginning of its deal. Because there were a lot of people watching boxing who had not ordinarily watched the sport. They were doing between 2 and 3 million viewers. It was great for the sport. Having boxing on network television is imperative for the growth of the sport, whether it's on Fox or CBS or ABC or whichever one wants to invest money into the sport. And I think it's going to wind up being CBS or Paramount, however they want to do it. It's necessary because you have to expose the sport to the masses and let people know about these incredible backstories for these fighters, and show 2, 3, 4 times a year, show the best of the best on network television. Maybe a fight like that's borderline pay-per-view that would be a low-level pay-per-view, put it on CBS, Fox, ABC, NBC, whatever, and let people enjoy the sport at its highest level. And as you well know, sometimes that's not even really necessary. You don't need a fight that has $5 million in license fees to make great, compelling television. So, sometimes you get, Jarrett Hurd against Julian Williams, which was an excellent back and forth fight, right? And a fight of the year candidate in which Julian Williams was upset by Jarrett Hurd. So, upset Jarrett Hurd. So, there's ways to do it, but I think without the involvement of network television moving forward, the growth of the sport is going to be very limited, because if you're trying to only grow the sport through apps that cost, whether it's $6 per month, $12 per month, whatever it might be, if you limit it to those types of platforms, the sport is not going to grow.
And so with that said, just playing off of what you said, and just a follow-up question, you mentioned, for example, a CBS, right, getting into boxing. Do you think it has to be network television from that traditional way, channel 2 on your linear TV box, or can it be an extension of a linear television family, like for example, a Paramount Plus? If it is like something like that, then there is going to be the monthly fee that you mentioned. So do you think it's like, is it the old school way? Is it the new school way? Is it a hybrid? What do you think?
I think what's realistic, especially from the Paramount Plus CBS side of it, I think CBS is not going to televise boxing once per month live on the network, because the network slots are too valuable. It's the most watched network on broadcast television, and they value the slots even on Saturday night. So they're not going to be giving them away the way that Fox was giving them away, just because the programming is cheap. So they value the slots. So you might see 3 maybe a year, ideally, if they were to do it that way. Show maybe 3 fights there, show some maybe FS1 level, maybe in between FS1 and Fox level, what were the Fox level fights on Paramount Plus, and then of course have Showtime with the boxing budget that it has, showing Showtime Championship Boxing once per month, showing Showbox essentially once per month. That's a lot of content, and it's a lot of inventory for one network or one corporation to undertake. But the corporation is funded well enough and committed to the sport well enough, I think, to do that. But again, if it's Fox and if ABC were to make some sort of deal off of what it already has invested in ESPN and Top Rank into the sport, it could be it doesn't matter. Just put it on broadcast TV. And I what you're asking too, though, is it essential for it to be on broadcast television? I would say that it is, because for people like us, I'm older than you, unfortunately, but for people like us, yes, we know how to use the apps. We, for our jobs, obviously, we have to use the apps and everything. But you can't discount a large percentage of the population in the United States that does not want to learn how to use an app, and they watch network television. They're still trained to watch network television. The numbers bear that out. So ignoring those people, particularly older people who have been boxing fans since they were young, I think would be foolish.
It is definitely a ever-changing landscape. And overall, it does seem like platforms and players who can have different options, whether it be a network TV on a broadcast old school way, if you can also have some kind of paid service, if you can have pay-per-views, you can have a social digital outlet for maybe undercards, things like that, right? If you can have those variables, it usually can help, and that can go with the offering that you're bringing in terms of the magnitude of that fight. So we'll see how everything plays out. It's changed a lot in the last few years, and I'm sure it's going to continue to change. I wanted to ask you about some other boxing news and also world news. We of course know what's going on with the conflict with Russia and Ukraine, and there's a lot of boxers that have been involved in this. One of those is Alexander Usyk. Now, Usyk did not need special permission to leave Ukraine. He's a father of 3 children, and it's Ukrainian law that he can leave. And it's been reported that he will leave to go into training. So with that said, do you expect to see Joshua Usyk the rematch sometime soon?
I don't know about soon necessarily, but I wouldn't be surprised if Usyk did. I don't have confirmation that he's definitely doing it, and I know what's been reported and everything. And I'm not saying that he won't, but there is this internal struggle. If you're a proud Ukrainian person who is watching your country being invaded, watching people that you love being killed, seeing children slaughtered every day, it's horrifying. And if you're a Ukrainian person, I don't know how you would justify it within yourself to walk away. And I'm not condemning Usyk if he does wind up doing that, because on the flip side, you could see it as a morale boost maybe for Ukrainian people to see one of your own being the heavyweight champion, or him and Tyson Fury, one of the 2 heavyweight champions of the world, going in and making you proud on this particular night, or trying to make you proud on this particular night against Anthony Joshua. So I could see it on the flip side. But I could also see Usyk ultimately deciding what Vasily Lomachenko decided when he walked away from what was roughly a $3 million payday to fight George Kambosos Jr. And, I see it's kind of disheartening a little bit when I see people picking apart what their involvement in the conflict might be when they're saying, well, Usyk's not really on the front. Listen, man, if you're in the United States in the comfort of your home or wherever, and there's someone in a war-torn country, I don't care if he's stopping traffic or whatever he's doing in said war-torn country. If there are bombs flying all over the place, just be quiet. Those people they have a lot of courage, and they're there to protect their families. And hopefully, if you're the type of person who would say something like that about Usyk or Lomachenko or Vitaly Klitschko or Vladimir Klitschko, reassess what you're saying and be a better person.
It's very easy to have an opinion behind a keyboard and on a couch comfortably. It's very different when you're in the heart of it. You mentioned Vasily Lomachenko, and you broke the news that he's decided to stay and fight in Ukraine. It looks like he'll be passing up, at least for now, that fight with Kambosos in Australia. There were other outlets that also posted this news, and I know that you were vocal about that. What was, what happened with that situation in terms of you being vocal about other outlets posting the news, and how would you like to see that change in terms of other outlets and the way that breaking news is reported in boxing?
This had been a festering thing with me for a long time. This was not a one-time deal. And look, let's just be full disclosure here. We're talking about ESPN Ringside's Twitter account. It was what you're referring to. I went after them on Tuesday, I think it was, because there's a pattern there going way back. Now, Mike Coppinger and I are friends. This was not really directed at Mike. I tried to specify that. I understand he might have been collateral damage, so to speak, as far as that goes. He and I had conversations about this privately. My thing is this: Mike breaks his fair share of stories. So do I. So do other people. Give people credit for the work that they do. And I don't even want the credit for myself. I want the credit for the outlet that helps me make a very good living and has been great to me over the course of, 15 years since I've worked there as a part-time employee, back when I was a newspaper writer for a long time. It's just important to me to just, and I'm not trying to sound like a Boy Scout here or anything. I'm just saying, just operate with integrity, which is what I put in the tweet. I was told that it was not an intentional thing. It is what it is, right? I have no malice toward anyone who works there. And again, I emphasize Mike and I have always had a professional respect for each other. Believe me, he and I behind the scenes go back and forth on some things sometimes that we agree to disagree about, no doubt about it. But all I think in every other sport, ESPN in particular, which is who we're talking about here, has credited, or in some cases maybe been forced to credit. If you want to go back to when Adrian Wojnarowski, who was a former coworker of mine at the Bergen Record, when he worked at Yahoo Sports, he broke literally every NBA story there was, and they were paying people a lot of money to cover the NBA. And then eventually they threw so much money at Woj, he went to ESPN, but he beat them darn near to death covering the NBA for a long time, until it forced them to acknowledge that he was breaking all the stories. And ESPN breaks its fair share of stories too, and other outlets should always credit them. It should be a two-way street. And look, the bottom line is, you ain't fooling nobody. Let's cut the smoke and mirrors type of stuff. Let's just, when you break a story, when someone else breaks a story, and I want to emphasize, I'm not directing this at Mike because he has credited me for my work and stuff, and we have a good understanding as far as that goes, he and I. But I just think, to be taken seriously and to proceed as an ethical news organization, you just should credit people for their work and just be on the up and up, because it's also insulting to the readers and to the fan. In our case, in our small world here in boxing, it's insulting to the people who follow it, because, and it's not necessary. You break some stories, we break some stories. We're all making a good living. We're thankfully doing this. It's all good. Not a big deal.
Speaking of ESPN, I wanted to ask you about another fighter, and he campaigned for a long time with Top Rank and on ESPN, and that's Terence Crawford. We know that he's now entered into litigation with Top Rank. He's saying there was a breach of contract. He's saying there was racism. We know that his contract with Top Rank is done, and it obviously doesn't seem like he's going to go back there based on that. We know that Spence versus Ugas is happening, and everyone, of course, wants to eventually see Crawford versus Spence. What do you think the future holds for Terence Crawford? Who do you think he'll align himself with? What's a possible fight for him, and when?
I think he'll eventually align himself with PBC, because what choice does he have, right? I mean, if he wants the fights that he wants, he's not getting it by operating on his own little island somewhere. It's not, he's going to be forced to, in some way, affiliate himself with PBC. And there have been discussions on both sides about that. He knows that if he wants to fight the winner of now obviously he wants it to be Spence, because that's the fight that Crawford wants. But if he wants that fight, he's going to at least temporarily have to affiliate himself with PBC. And I expect that to happen, because unless he wants to try to fight Josh Taylor, who of course is affiliated with his contract with Top Rank, his former promoter, who Terence Crawford, as you mentioned, is suing. What other options does he have, really? I mean, Boots Ennis is not contracted with PBC, but he is contracted with Showtime in a multi-fight agreement. I don't know how much money Terence Crawford would want to fight Jaron Ennis, but I would bet it would be a lot. people would be interested in that fight. But what sense does that make if you're Terence Crawford going on 35 years old and you've wanted to fight Errol Spence for 4 years or however long it's been? That's the fight that he wants, right? And that's the fight the public wants. And hopefully, while it's nowhere near the magnitude of Mayweather-Pacquiao, and it hasn't gone on nearly as long either, hopefully we'll get to see that fight. Ugas is not an easy out, as you well know. Not going to be an easy fight on April 16th, especially coming off major eye surgery for Errol. But if he wins the fight, let's hope that Terence Crawford, signs a 2-fight deal with PBC or agrees to a multi-fight deal with PBC, fights a reasonable welterweight in his first PBC fight, and then maybe fights Errol Spence toward the end of the year because, you don't want to get past its expiration date. And Terence Crawford's going to be 35 years old in September. Errol just turned 32. It's now or never pretty much.
Past its expiration date is an unfortunate thing that us boxing fans have to deal with way too often. And let's hope that's not the case. One final question before I let you go. You've been covering this sport for such a long time. It's a really interesting and unique time in boxing right now. Jake Paul has a contract with Showtime. He comes from YouTubing. There's Triller in the game that's adding musical acts and reshaping the ring. Probellum is trying some different things internationally. There's a bunch of new players, and we've talked about some of them during this interview. For a long time, it really wasn't like that. It was HBO had top quality fighters. Showtime did. It was just a different type of landscape. And obviously it's changed a lot now. How would you describe the way boxing is now in terms of this era versus other eras that you've covered?
Well, there's a lot of money still being spent on boxing for what has been perpetually called a dying sport. I've heard that since since I started covering it in late 1996, right? It's a dying sport. Here we are 26 years later, and it seems to be thriving. It's a niche sport. It's always going to be that now. I don't think it'll ever go back to the magnitude that it once possessed. And, even in the 80s, when Mike Tyson, because there's never going to be another Mike Tyson probably, but, when it was on network television, the biggest thing is when it went away from network television, I think is when you saw the shift in it being a mainstream sport that was really garnered a lot of attention to being a niche sport. But there's nothing wrong with being a niche sport with a passionate, loyal fan base, but it does need to grow because a lot of, people get very frustrated with, as you well know, the four sanctioning bodies and all the BS, the factions of different promoters and PBC and Top Rank and all. People just want to see the best fight the best. I mean, if you're a baseball fan, they don't say, well, the Yankees aren't going to play the Red Sox because so-and-so doesn't like so. No, they play 15 times, whatever it is. You know what I mean? So it's very frustrating. It's hard to be a fan of this sport sometimes. And I understand the frustration, while I am critical sometimes of people stealing pay-per-views or constantly complaining about pay-per-views, I get the fact because once upon a time, I was a boxing fan when I was a kid. I was a fan, so to speak. Now, I'm a professional writer and all, but you care about the sport. You're passionate about the sport. And I understand what it's like to be in that position when you just this is your enjoyment, right? I mean, the time you take away from your family or whatever else is important to you to invest it in caring about boxing. And it's like, if it's like Lucy with the football every time, you're just like, dude, come on, that's enough's enough, right? I mean, but I still think the sport is in a healthy place. And to answer your original question, I know I went in a roundabout way here, but having people like Jake Paul, people crap on Jake Paul and everything. Look, if he can generate, even if it's a few hundred boxing fans based on what he's doing, why wouldn't we as the boxing industry welcome that? That's 300 people that care about the sport that didn't care about it before. And what's wrong with that? And if you don't like Jake Paul, he's loud and he's in your face and all that kind of stuff. But that's kind of today's, I'm an old school guy, obviously, but like if you got to sell yourself. I mean, he's, if you ask Jake Paul in a quiet moment, could you beat Canelo Alvarez? I'm sure he would tell you, what, are you out of your mind? Of course not. But he's got to say what he's got to say with the camera on and stuff. So I guess having him involved in it, a Triller to a lesser degree, because they've created so many problems financially for people and constantly canceling events. And then, not putting on the Teofimo Lopez fight with George Kambosos, defaulting on the purse bid. I'm not sure we couldn't do without Triller in boxing, to be honest with you. But as it relates to Jake Paul, I mean, if it's going to bring eyeballs to the sport and bring attention to the sport, I don't see anything wrong with that.
100%. I've always said for a long time that even YouTubing or just creating your audience is a difficult thing to do. And there's no reason that you can't now bring that audience into boxing and increase the eyeballs for boxing. That can happen. And at the same time, we can hope for the best to fight the best. And hopefully that's what happens going forward here in 2022 and beyond. Keith Idec, I want to thank you so much for the time breaking it down and talking about the latest boxing news. And I hope to chat with you soon, my friend.
Thanks, Curran. I appreciate it, man. I appreciate you having me on. It's good to see you.